You might not know this, but before ChatGPT was first released to the public, it was often rude, confusing, and unhelpful. So researchers had to fix it by rewarding it when it gave helpful answers and penalizing it when it didn't. That worked at first, but when researchers tried to make it even more helpful, something strange happened. It started confidently making up facts, deflecting when you called it out, and agreeing with the user even when they are clearly wrong. So how can making something better make it worse? Turns out this isn't just an AI problem. It's actually a mathematical problem, one so pervasive that it has triggered economic crisis, driven species to extinction, and even helped bring down entire civilizations. Yet, it's also surprisingly simple. So simple that you've probably encountered it without even realizing it. Let's say you work for a car dealership. The exact type of work doesn't really matter. The point is that the owner wants to grow the business. So he announces a big bonus for whoever sells the most cars each month. Sounds reasonable, right? And initially, sales go up, profits increase, and employees are excited because they get a chance to make more money. But a few months later, profits start falling and customers stop coming back. What happened? Well, to win the bonus, salespeople become increasingly competitive. They offer deeper discounts. They pressure customers into buying unnecessary add-ons. Some even hide mechanical problems just to close another deal. So gradually, customers stop trusting this business. The dealership succeeded at selling more cars, but failed at building a healthy business. This pattern is so common that it has a name: Goodhart's Law. When a measure becomes a target, it ceases to be a good measure. This makes sense intuitively, but why is it true? To understand this, we need to introduce one of the most important yet least talked about concepts in science: complex systems. A business is a complex system. It's made up of many interacting parts: sales, products, customers, employees, suppliers, and more. And that gives the system some special properties. One of them is interdependence. This means all the parts are constantly influencing each other. A change in one part can alter all the other parts, for better or worse. That isn't a problem by itself. But when one part gets pushed too far to the extreme, like how the dealership owner tried to maximize sales, it can disrupt the other parts so much that the entire system collapses. Even though a failing business was the last thing the owner wanted. The problem wasn't sales. Sales are essential to any business. The problem was treating one number as if it represented the entire system, and then maximizing that number at all costs. Now, plenty of businesses have made this mistake before, but Silicon Valley gave us something that can repeat it 1,000,000 times faster. In the early years of Facebook, users loved it. It was a place to connect with friends and family, especially those living far away. Today, it's one of the least trusted social media platforms. Ironically, much of that decline began because Facebook tried to optimize user engagement. On the surface, that didn't seem like a bad idea. Wouldn't more engagement mean more connections? Well, the problem was how it's measured. The more comments, reactions, and shares a post received, the more Facebook considered it engaging. And as the algorithm maximized that metric, it started showing more sensational, controversial, and even false content, often from complete strangers. Because it attracted that kind of engagement, users saw fewer and fewer updates from friends and family. Many people stopped posting about their own lives altogether. Because the experience no longer felt like connecting with friends, it felt like arguing with the internet. So in trying to maximize one dimension of connection, Facebook undermined other dimensions, like trust, fun, community, and meaningful conversation. This brings us back to ChatGPT. We can now see why maximizing helpfulness inevitably made it less helpful, because helpfulness is also complex and multidimensional. It requires being correct, being thorough, being sincere, being cooperative, and more. But in the training algorithm, all of that got compressed into a single measure. Which response does the user prefer more? And when that's pushed to the extreme, the model learned increasingly weird ways to cater to the users. The result was sycophancy, an AI that's annoyingly agreeable, but not necessarily correct. Now, here's the disturbing part. At some point, the algorithm stopped being a computer program. It became a way of life. Have you ever heard of looks maxing? If you haven't, it's an internet trend where a lot of young men try to maximize their attractiveness by focusing on a handful of physical traits. Things like height, jawline, eye shape, and body fat percentage. Some takes it so far that they even attempt dangerous DIY procedures like bone smashing. Don't get me wrong, looks do matter, but attraction is far more complex. When you obsess with just the physical aspect, it often comes at the expense of others. Many looks maxers end up developing financial problems, chronic anxiety, and bad social skills, which ironically makes them less attractive. And that's just the tip of the icebergs. There are all kinds of maxing trends now. Tan maxing, sleep maxing, food maxing, LinkedIn maxing. Some of them are kind of funny, but other ones can be pretty harmful when pushed to the extreme. Okay, at this point you might say, couldn't those businesses or people just stop maximizing once they notice something is wrong? Well, here's the issue. The damage often doesn't become visible until it's too late. And that's because of another property of complex systems, non-linearity. In a linear system, a change in the input produces a proportional change in the output. But in a non-linear system, you can keep adding input for a long time without much happening, until suddenly one seemingly small change produces a disproportionately large result. This happens because complex systems often contain buffers, hidden reserves that absorb the change in ways that are not obvious. Let's look at an example. For nearly a decade, Amazon looked unstoppable. Delivery kept getting faster, costs stayed low, profits soared. Yet, in 2022, a leaked internal memo revealed that the company would soon run out of people to hire. What happened? See, in pursuit of maximum efficiency, Amazon reduced the entire job of a worker down to a handful of metrics. Every item scanned, packed, and delivered was tracked by algorithms. Any extended periods of inactivity would automatically trigger warnings, and in some cases, even termination, with little or no management involvement. Some workers were so scared of falling behind that they avoided bathroom breaks and urinated in plastic bottles. It was one of the most ruthlessly automated HR systems ever built. At one point, their turnover rate reached 150%. That's around 2 million workers being replaced every 8 months. Luckily, Amazon could still hire new workers quickly because the pool of available labor was large enough. It was a buffer that had been absorbing their turnover for years. But that buffer eventually ran out. To mitigate this labor shortage, Amazon raised wages, expanded employee benefits, and invested more heavily in automation. Whether those changes are enough remains to be seen. But the lesson goes far beyond Amazon. Because our society has buffers too, and many of them have been gradually draining for decades. After World War II, many Western countries experienced long periods of prosperity, rising productivity, expanding infrastructure, stable union jobs, affordable housing, and a growing middle class with high purchasing power. These were all buffers of a resilient economy, but beginning in the 1970s and 1980s, many corporations increasingly embraced the idea that maximizing shareholder value should be their primary objective, a view famously championed by economist Milton Friedman. And in the short term, everything looked healthy. Profits, stocks, and GDP continued to rise. Many middle-class families even benefited because they owned assets and stocks. But as this profit-maxing practice became increasingly dominant, everything else became expandable. Labor became a liability, product quality became a cost, and prices became something to push as high as consumers could tolerate. So over time, housing became less affordable, jobs became less stable, and the wealth gap continued to widen. the economy lost many of its buffers, which means today, a small disruption can potentially trigger much larger crises than before. In fact, some economists argue that we never truly recovered from the 2008 recession. What's worse, this pressure to maximize profit is so strong now, every new technology tends to get pulled in the same direction. Social media could have strengthened communities. Instead, it evolved towards engagement maxing, because that generated more advertising revenue. AI could have helped us learn better, work less, and think more critically. Yet, many companies increasingly use it as an excuse to lay off workers and push valuations as high as possible. Now, it might seem like we've found the culprit. Maybe capitalism is simply a giant profit-maxing machine. There's certainly some truth to that, but the deeper pattern turns out to be much older than capitalism. Consider the Maya civilization. For centuries, rival states competed to build ever larger monuments and more elaborate ceremonial centers to signal their divine rights to rule. In other words, they were status maxing. These massive constructions required enormous quantity of timber and stone. Forests were cleared, leaving much of the land more vulnerable to erosion and less able to retain moisture. Yet, for generations, Maya continued to flourish. Then, a series of severe droughts caused widespread crop failures, which led to famine, warfare, and collapse. On their own, these droughts may not have been enough to destroy such a thriving civilization, but after centuries of reducing its environmental buffer, the same stress became far more devastating. Okay, now you might be thinking, why do humans keep making this mistake? Why do we keep reducing complex systems into simple objectives? Well, turns out this tendency is even older than humanity. In fact, life itself has been wrestling with it for nearly 4 billion years. And surprisingly, that's also where we begin to find the solution. Every organism on the planet faces the same fundamental challenge. How do I survive long enough to reproduce? The trouble is, there are virtually infinite ways to pursue that goal. In math, this is called intractability. I won't get too into the details here, because I made another video about it. But the basic idea is this. Many complex problems have so many possible solutions that finding the best one would take an impractical amount of time. So given limited resources, an organism can only try a tiny fraction of all strategies. And oftentimes, the simplest ones ended up working first. Eat as much food as it's available, grow as fast as possible, have as many offspring as you can. But the problem, as we already know, is that these maxing strategies often fail in the long run. An animal that eats all the food today may leave nothing for tomorrow. One that has too many offspring may not be able to invest enough in each one. That's why you don't see every species evolving to be larger and stronger indefinitely. Instead, natural selection constantly balances competing trade-offs. Strong enough to defend yourself, efficient enough to survive famine, curious enough to discover new opportunities, cautious enough to avoid danger, aggressive enough to compete, cooperative enough to build partnerships. So the problem isn't simplifying complexity. You have to simplify. The challenge is to find strategies that are simple enough to work with limited resources, yet rich enough to capture the most important trade-offs. But evolution has one more lesson to teach us, and it begins with one of the most unassuming organisms on Earth, moss. When you think of moss, the words soft and cozy probably come to mind. Yet, 440 million years ago, they actually triggered the first ever mass extinction ever. How? Because when they first evolved, there was basically nothing to eat it or compete with it. So they expanded rapidly. And as they grow, they accelerated the breakdown of rocks, releasing huge amounts of nutrients into oceans. That fueled some of the largest algal blooms ever, which removed a lot of oxygen from oceans and carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. This triggered an ice age so severe that it wiped out roughly 85% of marine life. If you think that sounds crazy, plants did it again 70 million years later. This time, it was because of trees evolved. Their roots fractured bedrocks, releasing even more nutrients into oceans, triggering yet another climate catastrophe. Ironically, the first tree species went extinct partly due to itself, and Earth was never the same. But life didn't simply bounce back. It reorganized. More animals evolved to keep rapidly growing plants in check. More fungi and microbes evolved to recycle nutrients. Today's forests exist because countless organisms now balance one another in ways that didn't exist before. This brings us to perhaps the most important property of complex systems, phase transitions. A phase transition happens when a system is pushed past a critical threshold, causing it to reorganize into a fundamentally different state, much like how water freezes into ice at 0 degrees Celsius. But unlike ice that can turn back into water, many complex phase transitions, like those mass extinctions, are difficult or even impossible to reverse. In other words, success itself can forever destroy the conditions that made that success possible. And now, humanity finds itself approaching similar critical thresholds. Our drive to maximize has made us one of the most successful species on Earth. Yet, the same drive is beginning to erode our economy, society, and environment faster than they can recover. The difference is that so far life learned these lessons through millions of years of collapse, extinction, and reorganization. But we don't have to, because we can learn and understand complex systems. We can design our institution to account for their interdependence, non-linearity, and phase transitions. That means, first, we need to create metrics that reflects the system instead of just one part of it. Fortunately, many people are already doing it. For example, B Corp is a certification that evaluates a business based on 5 areas of impact: workers, customers, community, environment, and governance. Profit still matters because a business can't survive without it. But it becomes one of the objectives among several, rather than the only one that matters. Second, we need to build boundaries that protect the system before invisible damage becomes irreversible. Donut economics illustrates this beautifully. The inner ring of the donut represents the minimum boundary of a functioning society, things like food, housing, healthcare, education, and political voice. The outer ring represents the maximum boundary of a habitable planet, things like fresh water, biodiversity, and climate. The goal isn't to maximize GDP forever, it's to help society flourish within those boundaries. Third, we need to build institutions that can continually revise their own models and strategies as reality changes. Cooperatives are one example. These are businesses that are owned by workers or consumers, or housing and apartment complexes that are owned by residents. This not only gives people more share of the wealth, but also allows them to change how the organizations measure and govern themselves. Because the goal isn't to find one perfect number, or even a perfect set of numbers to maximize. It's to build systems that can keep learning what actually matters and keep balancing the things that allow us and the planet to thrive. Okay, I know, that sounds super optimistic. And honestly, it is. Because understanding complex systems doesn't magically make them easy to manage. In fact, we've only explored 3 of their properties today. There are more equally important ones like emergence. Because sometimes nobody chooses to maximize anything, yet the system still behaves that way anyway. If you're curious how that happens, I made another video just for that. You can also check out my playlist where I apply other system principles to economics, politics, and personal resilience. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.